Now, this is Steve from Des Moines. He asked a couple of questions. Your second question gives away the ending, and I think we're going to try to sneak around that during this show. But
Although he's welcome to email me separately if he has a question about the ending, and I'll be happy to answer if I can.
Of course, it's one of the questions I had too. So afterward,
Okay.
I'll get that, and maybe we'll talk about it.
Okay.
I don't think this gives away too much. Why was Mary Lincoln taken out of the narrative through her death? Her fascinating character was missed. Did you toy a bit with the reader with hints of a suicide or maybe her death involved with conspiracy?
Why did I take her out? It wasn't originally planned, but it actually I wanted to give a sense of Lincoln feeling completely alone in the White House. And you think of the great props were his family and his tiny handful of close friends, and it was important to me to have as much of that stripped away to make Lincoln's own character a lonelier one, and also in certain ways a more mysterious one. And then Mrs. Lincoln, who is a very popular character in fiction that Lincoln is involved in, for a variety of reasons, when I tried to write her into the novel, it became very complicated. Her role was a more complicated one, and I decided the story is easier without her. And here also, being in Illinois, I have to apologize, as people have now corrected me, of course. In the story, I say she drowned in Lake Springfield, and that's one historical error. That's all on me. It's just a mistake. I didn't realize somehow that there was no Lake Springfield at the time.
Yeah, nor was she there.
Nor was she there.
Well, there's your next book with Mary and with Salmon P. Chase and with Frederick Douglass. I think I have a novel for you right there. Let us go to some of the actual legal issues that are in here. There are legal issues in here.
Sure.
Here are a couple of pamphlets that we have. One is from James Speed. I have enough trouble with real history, let alone alternative. But here is James Speed as Attorney General in the constitutional power of the military to try and execute the assassins. Okay, this is a little bit outside your book there, but nonetheless, he was asked in the book to put together a pamphlet just like this. Now, another one who also did this was a Justice of the Supreme Court, Curtis, who wrote this blistering critique of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and this is by someone who, he was denouncing the actions of the president as a usurper, as a military despot, totally different than what Speed was doing. And it's interesting because Curtis had a view that the war against the South was just. In fact, he'd been one of the dissenting authors in the Dred Scott case. So here are two real legal issues that were occurring. Tell us the legal issues discussed in the novel and how they reflect their times.
And let me say, with respect to those two pamphlets, Curtis was interesting. Curtis was a well-known critic at the time of Lincoln's claims about what the war power allowed him to do. And though I'd never been able to see that lovely pamphlet before, I appreciate you letting me look at it before the show. But Curtis was, and he was not alone. There were a lot of critics at the time, something that's often forgotten. So in my hypothetical impeachment trial of Lincoln, the part that constitutes the second half of the book, the courtroom thriller half, there are 4 charges against Lincoln. And I want to just here talk about the first 2, because the second 2 are bound up in the story in ways that might give too much away. But the first 2 are things that Lincoln unquestionably did, and that I think we need to think about. So the first charge relates mainly to Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, and we tend to forget sometimes how enormously important habeas corpus is. In those days, it was common to refer to it, as Blackstone's language, as the first and oldest of the liberties of the Anglo-Saxon people, or something like that. Blackstone wrote, and the writ of habeas corpus is the reason the government can't scoop people off the street and throw them in prison without ever presenting to a judge. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus when the rebellion began. He suspended it first in Maryland, and then I think in Florida, and then ultimately nationwide. And he allowed his military commanders to ignore, and he had too ignored court orders of habeas corpus, because habeas corpus has been suspended. And when Chief Justice Taney, in the famous case of Ex parte Merriman, issued a writ saying the president had no power to suspend habeas corpus without the consent of Congress, Lincoln's basic position was, that's his opinion, my opinion is that I do have the power, and that was pretty much the end of that. Related to that is a second count of the indictment against Lincoln in the novel, which is that the shuttering of opposition newspapers and the jailing of some opposition journalists. Now, when we say opposition, this is a point that sometimes people miss. It doesn't mean they were his political opponents. It's speaking of opposition to the war. And the justification Lincoln offered for shuttering the newspapers was that some newspapers were interfering with the war effort by the stories they were publishing, the positions they were taking, and so on. Just as with respect to habeas corpus, his view was that he was locking up people who were encouraging mobs to interfere with the troops crossing Maryland, or people who were in other ways interfering with the war effort. And of course, in one notorious case, a speaker who was urging people to desert was, of course, banished to the South.
Landing him. Well, first to Canada.
Right, first to Canada, then to the South. Then he came back.
They were happy to get rid of him.
Right. Well, but what was interesting about all this is it's fair to say, I think, that Lincoln gathered more executive authority into his hands than any president in history, which was what Curtis said. Interestingly, that was also Charles Sumner's problem with Lincoln, that they had the same goals, but Sumner was a continental type. Sumner thought there should be parliamentary democracy. He believed in legislative supremacy. The president shouldn't be too powerful. He thought that Lincoln had gathered an amount of power that was inconsistent with the president of a constitutional republic. The point is that for each law that Lincoln broke, and he did break laws, and for each constitutional provision he violated, and he did violate constitutional provisions, his justification at each turn was that the survival of the United States was at stake, and this is something he had to do in order to save the country.
Well, what do you as a lawyer say to that? I mean, here you are, your country is being taken apart, and for one law here, one law there, of course that's how it starts, but the country comes apart now.
I don't think it's a legal question. I think it's a political question. It's the interesting thing is lawyers can tell you what the law says and whether it's been broken, but the question of whether it was right to break it or not, those are political questions, and they tend to be resolved historically. So the reason we forgive Lincoln is because the cause was so great and so important. The thing to bear in mind is that in every war we've fought, every president, from our first president to our current president, has at some point done things that critics thought went beyond the law or beyond the Constitution. And it's always for the same reason, that in a time of war, presidential power is always at its maximum, and presidents do what they think they have to do in order to win.
We have to be lucky to have good presidents, is what it comes down to.
Well, I hope it's not luck.
Not Napoleon.
I hope it's not luck. The point is that for all the different things we fight about and argue about, whether to raise this tax rate this much or lower it that much and so on, the moment, the unreviewable decisions the president makes are the decisions about war and peace and how to conduct a war when there is one. And those are the decisions that I think we should have uppermost in our minds when we go to the voting booth. Not any current war, but whose judgment do we trust when the next war or the next threat to America arises? Because that's when these questions arise. So in writing a novel where these questions come up, it's not a message novel. I'm not trying to say we need to think about this stuff. It's still just supposed to be fun to read, but nevertheless, it is the case that for me, working through those questions was difficult because I myself am torn about the right answer.
Are there give me a couple of examples of other questionable acts that other presidents did that might be impeachable in your mind, other than that don't involve a dress?
FDR, for example, herding the Japanese Americans in internment camps on the West Coast. Woodrow Wilson, quite famously promising before a joint session of Congress to crack down on dissent and then trying to do it, basically trying to lock people up for the sin of opposing the war. Just take a couple of, there are other examples as well, just a couple of the easiest examples right there. It's not uncommon in time of war. If you look at the most recent presidencies, there are a lot of people who are quite upset about the use of drones by the Obama administration. There are people who are upset about the interrogation techniques used in the Bush administration. You go back as far as you like, and you can always find things. What's interesting about all the complaints about other presidents is that none of those presidents held as much power in their hands as Lincoln did. It was not only Lincoln's opponents who called him at the time an elected dictator. There were some of his supporters who actually thought of him the same way. And some of them thought that was good. There were people who thought that was actually a good thing and what was needed in time of war.
I'm going to jump into something else for a second. You have General Daniel Sickles, say the following, that Mr. Lincoln inspires better than any man I've ever known. Well, do you yourself view an authentic Lincoln as a conspiratorial man, or was that just Sickles? And what do you think about that? Was Lincoln a conspiratorial type person?
The word conspiracy has taken on a meaning today that it didn't have in the 19th century. That is, when we use today, it's always something sinister, and all that conspiracy really meant then was working behind the scenes was really all that you needed to have a conspiracy. It didn't have to be something where you were really trying to take over the government or something. And all that I had in mind that Sickles was trying to say was that he tends to outwit his opponents, and that's true. In fact, I think. And no one really knew Lincoln, I think it's fair to say, knew him really well enough. And all his biographers talk about this all the time. But it seems to me the more Lincoln biographies I read, the more I get a sense that he took a certain pleasure in outwitting his opponents. He was famous for not holding grudges. But one of the reasons I think he was able not to hold grudges, he almost always won these little things. And sometimes he would rub people's faces in a little bit, and then he put it behind them.
He had ego. We shouldn't think that he didn't. And when he said that, when he was very depressed about Mary and other things, and one of the reasons I think he got out of his depression and didn't commit suicide when they took scissors away from him was that he felt there was something for him to live for. There was something within him, some greatness, and that takes ego as well, to feel that there's something like that in there. So I think that's a remarkable part of him that we don't talk about.
I think that's right, and Lincoln himself sometimes talked about his ambition, very frankly. And at the same time, though, he also had these rare political gifts. That is, and I was mentioning to someone recently, if you look at, say, James Russell Lowell's essay on Lincoln that he wrote in the 1860s and then was published in book form after Lincoln was murdered, Lowell draws an analogy between running a country and sailing a raft down a winding river with rocky shoals. And Lowell says something really interesting. He says that you're sailing this raft, everyone on the raft is scared, and you see calm water here and here, and everyone on the raft says, it's calm over there. Let's get out of the river. And Lowell's point about Lincoln is most politicians would go. You're right, let's go where it's calm. But Lincoln, he said, had this rare talent for resisting that and saying, well, no, I genuinely believe that although we could get to calm water here, there's even calmer water if we'll take a chance and keep going. Was willing to hold to that in the face of enormous, sometimes, public opposition. It's easy to forget how unpopular Lincoln was, say, in 1862 and 63, and even early 1864. And we forget that there was an enormous peace movement in the North, and Lincoln stood his ground, went his own way.
Well, once he had a thought in his mind, he had thought it through, as Billy Herndon, his law partner, said, he thought more than any man he ever knew. And when he came to a conclusion that he felt was correct, he hewed to it and stayed there. I mean, think of the pressures that were under him as president-elect to stop this non-nationalization of slavery. No, he said, that was the point that he would not go beyond. And the South had to hew to that or not.
Which, on the other hand, he sometimes changed his mind, generally with good reason. And, of course, one of those famous examples, I tried to remember for again in the book, I couldn't, is his early support for colonization of the slaves after they were freed. And after he met with a delegation of black leaders, who were all opposed to colonization, they all wanted to stay, he began to change his mind. It took him a while, he thought about it, but he ultimately turned completely around on the issue of colonization.
I think that was helped also with emancipation, that he saw a way out, maybe. Although I think, as we discussed in a show just a couple of shows ago, I think that his views on colonization were maybe partly because who wouldn't have worries in 19th century America about black and white living together? Could we really live together? Thankfully, we took the more rocky road and we're living together. But you can see where that might help to just separate us because of our past. And he may have thought that.
He may have, but here I actually agree with Eric Foner. I mean, I think Lincoln isn't right about everything. And on colonization, the colonization issue wasn't just he thought it through and it made a mistake. He really did have a kind of racial uneasiness that began to vanish over the ensuing years. And I think it's important to concede that. that point, even for those of us who admire Lincoln greatly. But it did seem to change during his years
Well, he
in the
came
White
up
House.
as white trash. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago too, and that he was a white man in America that had certain
Right, he grew up on the frontier,
and he was able to actually get through it himself and lead the nation with him.
And that was the important point, leading the nation. And you compare the Lincoln who came to office in 1861, that I would, if I could win the war without freeing a single slave, I would do it. The Lincoln who wanted to colonize slaves, wanted to raise money to buy them from the slave owners, with the Lincoln who, by the time that he meets with the Confederate Peace Commissioners toward the end of the war, and he tells them that he won't make peace on any ground that doesn't include a constitution banning slavery, and they're astonished. They said, he's never said this, what is he talking, this is all new. You see a Lincoln who had changed and had become very firm in his new view, as we were saying a moment ago, that having thought it through, having realized he was wrong about slavery in certain ways before, he was right it had to be abolished, he was wrong about how, it became a central part of the war policy by mid-1864. And that's a real crucial moment in American history that Lincoln doesn't, I think, get enough credit for. The change in his own view of what the ends of the war, to where he will not make peace on any ground that does not include a constitutional amendment, barring slavery.